everyone. My name is Allison Alexi. I'm an assistant professor here in Women's Studies and Asian Languages and Cultures. Before I introduce today's speaker, I have a couple announcements from the Center for Japanese Studies. The first is next Thursday's talk will be Professor Michael Emmerich, professor of Japanese literature at UCLA, and the director of the Tadashi Yanai Initiative for Globalizing Japanese Humanities. He'll be presenting a talk called On Listening, Murakami Haruki and the Prejudices of Global Literature. So I imagine that will be a popular topic, or possibly a controversial one, I'm not sure. The other announcement is next Tuesday, November 19th at 7 p.m., the Center for Japanese Studies and the University Art Museum will co-present a special kabuki lecture and a demonstration by actor Kyozo Nakamura, who I understand to be quite famous. Is that correct? Does anybody know? I'm assuming, yes, Yuri is making a face, so I'm assuming very famous. At the Helmut Stern Auditorium. This is free, which is exciting, and open to the public, with support for the Agency for Cultural Affairs. So if you're into kabuki or loudness in general, please go to that performance. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Michael Strausz, who is an associate professor of political science at Texas Christian University, and also the director of Asian Studies there. Normally, I think we all feel a little bit bad asking someone to come up in the middle of Michigan winters, right? Especially when it's early snow and extra cold. But lucky for all of us, Dr. Strausz grew up in the state of Michigan, so we don't have to apologize to you, and we can instead say, welcome home. Did you miss the snow?
You know, a little bit.
Okay, great. Well, then we provided it for you.
Yeah, thank you. No, I'm glad. I'm just glad I was able to get here. I was a little worried.
Yes, we were too, or are too. So Dr. Strausz did his undergraduate degree in political science at Michigan State University's James Madison College, and then earned an MA and PhD in political science from the University of Washington in Seattle. His hobbies include cooking, hiking, and schmoozing, which I thought was hilarious. So if you like to schmooze as well, he is apparently a professional.
That's what we're here for.
That's what we're here for. So please join him in schmoozing later. Let's see. So today he'll be giving us a presentation from his very newly published book, which is really exciting, incredibly helpful for those of us who study Japan, because as you either know or you will learn shortly, Japan has a kind of unusual policies around immigration and refugees, accepting refugees. So Dr. Strausz is a specialist on this. His book was published recently by the SUNY Press, and it's called Help Not Wanted, Immigration Politics in Japan. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Strausz.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Allison. So as Professor Alexi mentioned, I went to Michigan State for undergraduate. My father, who's sitting in the back, he's a University of Michigan alum. And then, so I went to Michigan State, and then as I was looking at graduate schools, I applied to a variety. The first graduate school I went and visited, I didn't end up going there, but the one I visited was Ohio State. And then when I got back, there was some sort of family event, and my uncle pulled me aside and said, "Michael, don't do this to your father." So I didn't. So I took some mercy by not going to the other enemy school. But okay. So the main question that I'm asking in this book that I'm going to be talking about today has to do with something that we probably all know on some level. Is that why does Japan have so few foreign residents? So if you compare Japan with other OECD countries, you can see Japan is on the very end, has a really small percentage of foreign residents. At this time, this data was from 2013. Japan had under 2% of its population was foreign residents. Since then, last year, for the first time, Japan climbed over 2%. Last year, they reported 2.7 million foreign residents, which is still under 2% of their population. So it's still a very, very small percentage of the population, both in real terms, but also compared with many of Japan's peers. And so that was the starting point for this book. And I think that this is an important question to ask for a few reasons. The first has to do with a short-term problem. And this is a problem. I was living in Japan in 2016 researching this book. And as I was walking around, I started to see these help wanted signs everywhere. So this is just, I actually put together an album of, 100. I just would take a picture every time I saw a help wanted sign just to illustrate this. But This is actually a bus that was driving to my campus where I was. It says bus drivers wanted on the side of it. And a lot of these are convenience stores, but one, I couldn't get a good picture of it because, well, you'll understand why in a minute. But at a local police station, like right by the train station, there was a huge prefectural police officers wanted sign, but I didn't want to be the weirdo like going right up to the police station and taking pictures, so you'll just have to trust me on that one. But these signs are also backed up by data. And I'm going to show you in a minute, there's this company called the Manpower Group, and they go out and survey hiring managers all over the world, and they ask them, are you having, I think one of the main questions they ask them is, are you having trouble filling jobs? And you see that in Japan, for the last several years, more than 80% of hiring managers in Japan say that they're having trouble filling jobs, which has consistently, for the last several years, been the highest percentage in the world. I think they poll hiring managers in about 50 countries. So it's not every single country, but it's a lot. And you see, by the way, so here, the x-axis here is the y-axis, rather percentage of firms that are having difficulty filling jobs. You see Japan's at the top. And then on the x-axis here, I put percentage of foreign residents. And you can see, perhaps not surprisingly, that as your percentage of foreign residents goes up, it becomes easier to fill jobs, because often those foreign residents are foreign workers, essentially. So this is one reason I think this is puzzling. Japan has these intense labor shortages, and they know, just looking at the overall trend in the world, that one way to fill these labor shortages is through foreign labor. But a second reason this is an important question has to do with a longer-term demographic problem. And that's the Japanese word is shoujikoreika, but in English this means the problem of declining birth rates and like more old people, basically. And so in a typical country, historically, we have what's called a demographic pyramid, right? So you have a lot of young people, fewer middle-aged people, and fewer old people. But in Japan, that population pyramid is flipping upside down. So you have few young people, more middle-aged people, and even more elderly people. And this causes a problem for Japan for a number of reasons. The first reason has to do with the question of who will physically care for these elderly people as they lose the ability to do things for themselves. So who will actually do those care worker type jobs? There simply aren't enough laborers in Japan to do those jobs. But the second reason that this is problematic is there's just the question of who's going to be working in other jobs in the economy to keep the economy moving to produce money to pay for those jobs. Right? So who's going to, in other words, who's going to keep the Japanese healthcare system running, the Japanese social pension system running, in the absence of sufficient young people? And so returning to that graph that we just looked at, in Japan, more than 30% of the population, as of, I think this was last year, is over the age of 60. This is also the highest percentage in the world. And one thing that differentiates Japan from some of the other countries that have similarly low percentage of foreign residents is that, right? So if you want to differentiate Japan from Hungary, Poland, and Mexico, Japan has a much higher percentage of its population that are old and getting older. And I always just, because people are interested, I'll give you the rest of the numbers. People always want to know about the US. Right around 20% of the population in the US is over the age of 60. Okay. So the third reason I think this is an important question to be asking has to do with the question of international status or international image. So often Japan's governing elites are concerned about the way that Japan is talked about by other countries, and specifically by advanced industrialized countries. Now there's some exceptions to this. Whaling is an exception. I've done some research on that as well. I'm happy to talk about it a little bit in question and answer. But for the most part, Japanese governing elites are really aware of what's being said about Japan and concerned about it. But immigration, and specifically actually the issue of refugees, this is a place where Japan actually looks really bad compared with the advanced industrialized world and doesn't seem all that concerned about changing it. So I'm going to show you two graphs now. So the first is just the number of refugee applications in Japan and typical European Union countries. So the green line is Japan, and you see, and the blue line is the median European Union country, so the typical European Union country. So you can see in the last several years, Japan was roughly comparable to a typical European Union country. In 2017, actually, Japan had many more asylum applicants than your typical European Union country, although there were a few, I think it was Germany and a few others that pull the mean way up. The yellow bar is the mean. So in other words, Japan is getting a lot of asylum applicants. So in 2017, they had almost 20,000 asylum applicants. But how many of these people are actually getting asylum? So in Japan, these numbers are usually in the double digits. So they get almost 20,000 applicants, and like 17 of those people get asylum. Right, so you can see this is a place where Japan compares very unfavorably with your typical European Union country. Right, we're something more like in the median country, close to 17% getting asylum. In Japan, it's 0.01%, or I think about 0.1% of applicants are getting asylum. And the people that aren't, well, there's a couple different. We can talk about what happens to the people that don't get asylum, but it's not that great for those people. Okay. So this is a place where Japan looks bad relative to some of its peer countries, and where Japan has this demographic and economic need. So why does Japan continue to exclude immigrants? And so before we get to my argument, I'm going to walk you through a couple arguments that we see in scholarship in Japan, and also that we hear from pundits and that I heard from politicians and business people when I was doing interviews in Japan. And the first explanation had to do with essentially the supply of the immigrants. And here the argument was, this argument was made to me often by business people, but also by especially government bureaucrats. They said, look, laborers can come to Japan if they want to, they just don't choose Japan. They'd rather go elsewhere. And I think that there's something to this argument when you focus only on what we would call high-skilled immigrants. And here I'm using high-skilled immigrants to mean immigrants that are working in jobs that require a 4-year college degree. So for the most part, it's true, and we can talk about why in question and answer, but that Japan is unattractive for the most part to high-skilled immigrants, the computer engineers and the professors, right? So although I'm sure we all know some foreign professors in Japan, but overall, it's not that attractive to those people. But widening the lens a little bit and looking beyond the high-skilled immigrants for lower-skilled immigrants, for people that aren't working in jobs that require a college degree, for nurses, for construction workers, Japan is actually attractive because the wage difference is so impressive. So one example is if you compare the wages of a typical nurse in Vietnam with what he or she would be making in Japan, the difference is 10 times. So in other words, they could make 10 times more as a nurse what you had gotten in Vietnam if you manage to get into Japan. So that's essentially adding another 0 to your paycheck at the end. So I think for that reason, Japan is actually very attractive to lower skilled immigrants. And similarly with refugees, it's true if you look at the world, like if you go to a refugee camp where there are maybe people that fled the Syrian civil war, if you gave them a choice, what country would you want to go to? If you could go anywhere, Japan would probably usually not be their top choice. They would probably rather pick Germany or the US or a place with maybe a substantial Syrian population with a lot of Arabic speakers. They wouldn't pick Japan. But if you gave them a choice, you can go to Japan or you can stay in this refugee camp. And if you go to Japan, we're going to teach you Japanese, help you find a job, which is what Japan, when people get asylum, Japan actually treats them very well. So it would be hard, I think, to turn that down. Right? So I think that the idea that, foreigners just don't want to go to Japan, that's why you don't have a lot of foreign residents, I think doesn't tell us the whole story. And a second set of arguments that I look at in the book have to do with institutions. So today, right now, I'm just going to talk about international institutions like the European Union. Because one argument that's made when people look at countries like Germany and France and various Northern European countries, Sweden and et cetera, that have gradually become countries of immigration in the post-war period, sometimes people make the argument that those countries did not want to become countries of immigration. What they wanted was to admit temporary laborers from Turkey and from elsewhere. But then because of the European Court of Justice and other institutions of the European Union, they were essentially compelled to permit family reunification and to permit those Turkish and other laborers from staying in their countries longer. And so therefore, the argument is that because Japan is not a member of the European Union or another institution that has similarly sort of stringent or similarly powerful courts attached to it, Japan was not compelled to admit foreigners the way that Germany was, or West Germany at the time that we're talking about. And I think the problem with this argument, well, there's a couple of them. The first is that it doesn't explain countries like Canada and Australia that sort of increasingly turn to immigration in the post-war period, despite obviously not being members of the European Union. But also, I think if we look more carefully at many of the European countries, the scholars have, they basically argue that the story of sort of a reluctant set of states fighting with a very pro-immigration supranational bureaucracy is an oversimplification. That actually there were a lot of pro-immigration forces within the various states as well. So to ignore those and to write them out of the story is a problem. So the third argument that I'm going to briefly touch on has to do with, it goes back to Chalmers Johnson, his idea about the developmental state. So Chalmers Johnson was a political scientist that wrote about Japan, among other things. And he published this book in 1982 called Meaty and the Japanese Economic Miracle. And in this book, he argues that one of the reasons that the Japanese economy was able to grow so quickly in the post-war period was because of really intelligent, far-sighted, thoughtful, long-range planning by central government bureaucrats who had what he called a developmental state ideology. They were thinking about the long-term economic health of Japan, and because they did that, and because they were very had a lot of foresight, they funneled resources into the right industries. And that's how we explain how Japan became an economic leader. And so a number of scholars have tried to make a similar argument about Japan, but I think that the problem with the way that those scholars have done it, I think, is that they haven't actually spent a lot of time looking at what the bureaucrats and politicians that govern immigration in Japan say. Right? So they've sort of relied on Chalmers Johnson's idea that, oh, bureaucrats are very long-range thinkers, but they haven't actually looked at, well, how are these bureaucrats and politicians justifying Japanese immigration policy? Okay, so that brings us to my explanation. So in order to, I'm going to show you a slide in a minute that's going to sort of set up my explanation. But basically, my explanation relies on a 2x2 table, because political scientists, we love our 2x2 tables. So I have to, out of loyalty to my discipline, I have to have one. But so I'll talk, and I'm going to talk about each axis of the table separately. But this table is going to help us, it helps me classify different types of immigration control regimes. So this helps us think about Japan in comparative perspective. Oh no, wait, what just happened? Oh, there we go. Okay. So the y-axis here suggests that businesses and the state in the advanced industrialized world are often fighting about issues of immigration. So this is, and when I say businesses, I'm especially talking about labor-intensive businesses. So the state is often opposed to immigration. Labor-intensive businesses are often, they want immigration for economic reasons. They need the laborers. So what's the result of that struggle? Does the state win? Or does the state lose? And based on what happens, that shapes the degree to which a country permits immigrants. And I'm going to talk about that axis first, but I just want to highlight what the second axis is, because we're going to get to that later. The x-axis has to do with elite thought. Specifically here, I'm talking about the governing elites. So is there a substantial number of governing elites that essentially think that foreigners belong in the country? That foreigners, some group of foreigners, and I sort of talk about several different ways that people can make this argument, but is there a substantial number of elites that think that looking out in the world, there's some foreigners that we should be admitting? And in Japan and some other countries as well, I argue that basically the answer to both of these questions is no, and therefore Japan doesn't become a country of immigration. So like I said, I'm going to talk about each of these axes separately. So first I'm going to talk about this one, the struggle between labor-intensive businesses and the state. So why did the businesses lose this struggle? Well, in order to understand that, I think it's important to actually step away from immigration for a minute and talk about agriculture. So if we look at, I guess, from Michigan State, I'm always thinking about agriculture. We have a very good agriculture school there, right? If you compare Japan with some of its peer countries, you see that one thing that differentiates Japan from these countries is, especially in the time period where these countries started to admit foreign laborers, Japan still had a really large percentage of its population that was working on farms. And this matters because if you think about the world from a perspective of a large firm that's trying to build a factory, who's going to work in that factory? Well, one easy place to recruit workers is you can go to a rural area, you can tell people, come to the city, we'll pay you better than you're making on your farm, the hours will be better, you'll be living in a big city, you'll have all these advantages, and you can pull people in from the farms. But because Japan had a large percentage of agricultural workers much longer than the rest of the advanced industrialized world, Japanese businesses were able to do this much longer than the rest of the advanced industrialized world. And I want to highlight, I probably should have written West Germany, but I want to highlight an example, because it was West Germany at the time we're looking at, a comparison between Germany and Japan. So in 1961, about 13% of the German labor force was working on farms. And by 1961, this is when Germany first started to sign guest worker agreements with Turkey and with 3 other countries. They had signed guest worker agreements to start. In other words, businesses had gone to the Turkish state, or to the German state, and said, hey, we need some additional source of labor. And so Germany was starting to work out these guest worker agreements. Now, Japan didn't reach the level of its economy working in, the percent of its economy working in agriculture that Germany was at in 1961 until 1973. Okay. Now, by 1973, interestingly, we saw some of the same things going on in Japan that had been going on in Germany in 1961. Japan hadn't signed any guest worker agreements, but the Japanese state had started to admit in small numbers some foreign laborers. I think there were about 300 nurses from South Korea that Japan admitted. There was very small, there was something like 10 machinists from Taiwan. And there were these were people being brought in on temporary contracts. The language trainees, they were being brought in as trainees, and the notion of bringing in foreigners as trainees continues to be influential in Japan today. But then in the world, in 1971, you had, or 73 rather, you had the Yom Kippur War, and then you had the OPEC oil embargo, and you had basically a global recession. And so the intense labor demand the Japanese firms were facing when they were pushing the Japanese state faded away. Right? Because of the global recession, they were no longer facing labor shortages, so they stopped pressuring the Japanese state to admit foreign residents. And really they didn't return to having intense labor shortages like they had in 1973 really until the 1980s. And really the late 1980s is when a big law was passed that we can talk about in question and answer. That was the Japanese state's first attempt to let in a relatively small number of foreign residents as laborers. But Japanese elites, by this time, by the mid-80s, had about 25 years to observe the European experience, and especially the West German experience with immigration, and they came, the sort of the consensus opinion of Japanese elites, and particularly Ministry of Justice officials, was that the West German experience and the French experience with foreign residents was a failure. Okay, now, we don't have to agree with that interpretation. We just have to note that this is how Japan's governing elites were interpreting the situation at that time. And so therefore, they fought very hard against efforts by some big businesses that were pushing for a visa category that would be set up for unskilled labor, something like guest workers. And instead, they met those businesses halfway by offering them the trainee and technical internship program, which let in people in a much smaller number, in a much more limited capacity to fill some of those jobs. But they did not give businesses what they were asking for in terms of a larger number of unskilled laborers on visas that specifically let them do that visa, that kind of labor. Okay, so that's the overall argument about the struggle between labor-intensive businesses and the Japanese state. But what about this piece of the argument? how do we know that there's not a conception of Japanese national identity among Japan's governing elites which suggests that foreigners belong in Japan? And I think to illustrate this, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the closest case that Japan has. And this has to do with what are called Nikkei-jin, or people with Japanese ethnicity. So Nikkei-jin, in that 1989 law that I talked about, that's basically formalized the training and technical internship program for the first time, that law also established a new visa category. Now, interestingly, the makers of the law didn't think that visa category was going to be widely used. I think that's a common misconception, but they introduced this new visa category, and the visa category was for people with Japanese ethnicity. The visa category is called long-term residents. Right, so you might look at that and see, wait a minute, if they're welcoming back people with Japanese ethnicity from abroad, and I think the largest number of people, by the way, that use this visa category are from Brazil. There's also a lot that come from China and from Southeast Asia and Peru. But if they're welcoming back people from foreign countries that maybe their parents or their grandparents moved away from Japan, isn't that a suggestion that these Japan's governing elites recognize these people as belonging in Japan? And I think to answer that question, it's helpful to think about what happened in the year 2009. So now I'm going to show you a graph that shows basically the three most important sources of unskilled labor in Japan, but let's just focus on the blue line for now. So the blue line is the numbers of people that were in Japan on that long-term residency visa, the visa for the Nikkei-jin visa, the visa that's for people with Japanese ethnicity. So we had another global recession in 2008. And then in 2009, you see that the other two, the trainees and technical interns took a sharp dip but started recovering. The numbers of foreign students never really declined all that much. But the numbers of long-term residents in Japan really took a sharp dip. And that's because the Japanese state started paying these people to leave. Right? So it was like a deal. If you took the money, you promised not to come back to Japan for 10 years. Right? So I think that when we think about that as the Japan's approach to this, relatively the short-term problem of the 2008 recession is that encouraging people with Japanese ethnicity to leave, then it's hard to argue that the Japan's governing elites see these people as sort of ethnic returnees coming back to the homeland. Okay, so that's the argument of the book in a nutshell. And now I want to briefly, I have like an hour, right? Okay. Now I want to briefly talk about something that happened. This was a little tricky for me as an author because I probably would have, all things being equal, I would have liked to write a whole chapter about what just happened last year. And actually I think we're still not totally sure. I think the changes are still happening regarding last year's immigration reform. But I was able to get in a few paragraphs in the book to talk about it, but I think that I will continue to research the impacts of this law into the future. But so at the end of last year, the Japanese Diet, led by the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democratic Party, that's basically been in control in Japan, with few exceptions since 1955, passed a law which set up which basically they revised this law, the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act, and the revision did a couple things which are really noteworthy. The first thing is, this revision for the first time permitted Japan it set up new visa categories which went to unskilled or low-skilled laborers for the first time. So this includes, there's a visa category for construction workers, agricultural workers, and caregivers, which are sort of not nurses, but sort of a step, people with less formal education than nurses, caregivers, which do really important work in Japan. There hadn't been visa categories for them in the past, but now there are. Okay, so this was a very, very big deal. And this actually was in tension with what Japan had been saying in the past, like, oh no, we will never give low-skilled workers visas to come to Japan because that's not the kind of country Japan is. Well, they did that. And so this law was passed on December 8th. 2 weeks later, December 12th, the Abe administration, the cabinet announced formally that this was their target. So they were going to aim for about 350,000 people in the next 5 years to use these 14 new visa categories. And in addition to that, one of the things that this law did was it created a new government office to help foreigners adjust to Japan. So these were really big changes. And they went into effect in April. The government is just releasing data about them. So between April and the end of June, the government put up a report. The Ministry of Justice has a report on their website. And you can see that they're sort of off to a slow start towards the 350,000. So they've admitted 20 so far in the first 3 months. You can see this is where they are. So there's 11 foundry workers from Thailand, 6 industrial machinists from Vietnam, 2 agricultural workers from Cambodia, and 1 lonely food and beverage manufacturing worker from Vietnam. And I think these numbers will likely go up. And I'm hoping, because that was June, that I'm hoping that we'll get the numbers through the next 3 months, through September soon. I just checked the website on Monday. They hadn't yet posted the report that gives the newer data. So we don't know, actually, what this policy is going to end up looking like, or how this policy is going to be implemented in the future. But I think that the way that this policy happened, I think makes sense, or we can use the argument in my book to make sense of what happened. And if we think about my argument as having 2 pieces, the first has to do with the economic context, the context of the struggle between the state and labor-intensive businesses. This graph right here, these 2 lines this is just basically a measure of labor shortages. So higher numbers mean more intense labor shortages, right? So the blue line is for first-time job applicants. The red line is for all job applicants. And you can see that actually one of the big peaks was that period that I was telling you about, 1973. And then the next peak was right around when Japan reformed the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act in a major way to set up the Nikkei Gene visa, the long-term residency visa, as well as the training and technical internship program. And you can see that in about 2016, Japan reached the level of labor shortages, basically the level of labor shortages that it had been at in 1990 when this law was reformed, and then it kept going. And I think this graph goes through to 2017. In 2018, the numbers were still higher, right? So labor-intensive businesses are really desperate. And I think that one of the ways that you see this, or the extent to which businesses are already relying on foreigners, is if you walk into a convenience store in Tokyo, you're very, very likely to be helped by a foreigner. And those people are often on student visas, and we can talk about how that happens in a minute. But I think that's a reflection of the intense labor shortages in Japan. So labor-intensive businesses continue to lobby hard for we need some relief, and especially with the Olympics coming up next year, as well as this is the continued question of Fukushima cleanup, which I think is a very upsetting discussion of this is why we need foreigners to do this horrible, dirty work of cleaning up Fukushima. But anyway, with those 2 issues in the back burner, businesses are saying we need foreign laborers. And so they got it. But the way that Prime Minister Abe justified this policy was to basically repeatedly claim this is not an immigration policy. I actually have a book chapter coming out next year called "This is Not an Immigration Policy," which is all about the struggle. Because you just kept repeating this over and over, it drove the opposition crazy because it very obviously is an immigration policy. But Abe kept repeating it, and the reasons that he and his supporters were repeating this was not an immigration policy were for 2 reasons. So first, that foreign workers admitted under these new visa categories would not be permitted to bring their families. So to use a word that we've heard our president use in the United States, he would not permit chain migration. But a second reason that Abe said that it wasn't an immigration policy was because these would be temporary workers, right? So the limit right now basically is 5 years. So after 5 years, these people would have to leave. So therefore, they're not going to be long-term immigrants settling in Japan. They're going to be short-term foreign laborers, and then they're going to leave. And if the economic conditions change, or if we're not happy, we can maybe make them leave earlier. I think that's the subtext there. So in other words, the governing elites in Japan right now haven't really changed their thinking about the long-term role of foreigners in Japan. Okay, so what is this 350,000 people? If they can find 350,000 laborers to fill those positions, that won't be enough to solve the problems that I talked about at the beginning of the talk. And therefore, more change is likely coming. And I want to close on what direction that change will likely take, because I think there's two possible directions. One is, if Japan continues to admit foreigners in the way that they admitted those 350,000 people as not immigrants but temporary foreign workers, I think Japan will go to this quadrant. Similar to the Gulf states and to Switzerland, where foreigners are treated as temporary, not potential citizens, people that come in and work and then leave, right? So that's one possible direction. However, I think that it's also possible, because the Abe administration is not going to last forever. It's possible the LDP will not remain in power forever. Or also the bureaucrats might actually be able to take some control over the immigration admissions process. And we can talk about how in question and answer. But if something changes, and especially if a different political party is able to take power with a different vision of Japanese national identity, then I think it's possible that we could see, as Japan continues to admit immigrants, Japan could move in this direction. But I think right now it's basically headed this way. So I think in order for it to move in this direction, I think we'd have to see some substantial changes at the top. OK, so thank you very much. And there's a few more help wanted signs there. This was my favorite one, but they wouldn't put it on the cover of the book because they were, anyway. But they didn't know about copyrights and stuff. But anyway, so thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
We have microphones. Oh, hello? Yes, we have microphones, and if anyone has questions or comments, I'd be happy to share them. Yes.
No, that's fine.
Thank you very much for your great discussion, presentation. And my question is, in the presentation, you said Japan is not attractive for higher level foreigner, especially computer engineers. So could you tell me your observation why Japan is not attractive for computer engineers? Because in Japan, especially in IT sector, industry suffer a lot for shortage of IT engineer, and they want to invite more foreigner, but you mean there's this gap, right?
Right.
So could you tell me your observation?
Yeah, so I think my concern, when I look at high-skilled workers that have, especially if you're a high-level computer engineer and you can pick lots of different countries, if you choose Japan, you're faced with the same difficulties of being a laborer in Japan that Japanese laborers are faced with. So the expectation of very long work days, very limited social life. So it's not even putting aside the question of whether you worry about facing discrimination, which maybe you don't, but the problem is the work life in Japan is not very attractive even for Japanese people. So the idea of selling that to a computer engineer that could pick different countries, like maybe I'll move to Japan and work 16-hour days and then be expected to socialize with my coworkers after that every night, that's not attractive. So that's my concern.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. Yes, Levy.
I have two awkward, difficult questions. Incredibly informative. Thank you so much, Michael. One is, you didn't really use the C word, the culture word,
right,
to talk about xenophobia. I'm wondering how we can get from this largely statistical analysis to the why questions as to why it is that they have these ludicrous gaps between stated policies like immigration goals and these tiny numbers of actual implementation. And the other is that maybe there's a connected question, this is also difficult. Help us project, what can we expect in 20 years? You got to it a little bit at the very end, but what can we, and predictions are always very dangerous, but
especially 20 years.
Right, but let's think about this. 20 years from now,
yeah,
what can we reasonably expect given what you know about the trends that you've been researching historically?
Okay, so I'll talk about the first question first, about xenophobia. Because I think this is a place where, on the one hand, I see maybe the most serious disjuncture between elites and the Japanese public. Because overall, the Japanese public, looking at public opinion data, is not particularly xenophobic, right? Overall, foreigners and immigration polls reasonably well. It's been polling increasingly well lately. But if you talk to politicians, they act like every single Japanese person hates foreigners, and we can't, oh, we recognize that we need foreigners, but it's too hard because of the public opinion. And I think that part of the reason for that has to do with the fact that the anti-immigrant section of the public is small, but it's very vocal and well organized. And so I'm going to show you, so I actually just did a survey experiment earlier this year with one of my undergraduates at TCU and a Todai graduate student. And we presented Japanese voters with a candidate. And then we made the candidate very normal. I think the hobbies were shogi and running and music appreciation. And we picked, those were so we made the candidate very normal. We randomly varied the candidate's stance on immigration. And then one of the questions that we asked, I think before we presented them with the candidate, was we asked, some people say that Japanese society, that foreigners enrich Japan. Others say that foreigners threaten Japan. What do you think? And we gave them a 10-point scale. And so I'm going to show you some of these results, because I think that they're pretty interesting. Right, so here, this is the more xenophobic answer. Foreigners threaten Japan. This is the less xenophobic. Foreigners enrich Japan. And this was, we also varied whether the candidate supported foreign labor or whether the candidate supported immigration. And you can see that we set this up so the 5 here, that means I would not vote for that candidate. The 1 means I would definitely vote for that candidate. The people that were really xenophobic, both for foreign labor, the foreign labor framing, and for the immigration framing, this is going to affect the way that they vote. Right, so this was a minority, right? So most of our respondents were on this side. They were on the enriched Japan side. But this minority, on this side, they voted on this issue. But as you get towards the multiculturalist side, it doesn't affect the way that they vote. So they didn't punish people for taking a pro-immigration side, but they also didn't reward people. And it was the case with both immigration and foreign labor. So I think that a part of the reason that Japan's governing elites say, oh, the Japanese people are so xenophobic is because those are the people that they hear from. Those are the people that call their offices to complain, that do big protests, right? The people on that side. But in terms of prognosticating 20 years, that's really hard. I mean, honestly, I think that a lot of it is going to have to do with what happens after Abe. So can the LDP find another leader, or will the Constitutional Democrats be able to set up an effective coalition of the left? I think that if the Constitutional Democrats are able to set up an effective coalition of the left and take power, which that doesn't happen much in Japanese history, but if they're able to do that, then I think it's possible that we'll see new kinds of inclusive policies, attempts to incorporate foreign residents, family reunification, those kinds of policies. But I think if the LDP remains in power, I think that they're really going to go for the Swiss model of temporary guest workers rather than anything to make it easier for those foreigners to remain in Japan. And I don't see, unfortunately, in either model, maybe with parties to the left it would be different, but certainly with the LDP, I don't see any change in refugee policy. Yes. Yes. I think they'll bring.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have 2 questions. The first one is that there are 20 successful applicants, but I was wondering how many people actually applied for the visa status.
So it was like 19,000.
Why?
And that was 2017. 2018, it was a little better. It was like 15,000 and about 40. But even so, it was,
Yeah, the new policy.
I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about refugees. So I don't know. And so I don't think it's the case that a lot of people are being rejected. I think that the bureaucratic wheels are turning slowly.
Okay.
That's my guess on that, because I don't think they're being super exclusive like they were with refugees.
Okay. The second question I have is also about the future trend. I think the 2 directions that you were talking about earlier, the underlying assumptions is that the labor-intensive industry are going to try to convince the government to have a more relaxed labor policy. But I was wondering, given the automation of labor in Japan, I'm always very impressed by how the lifelike robots are produced in Japan. I was wondering how that will going to change the future trend.
Yeah, no, and that's certainly something that's always mentioned in regards to immigration is automation. And that's something also that's difficult to predict. But some of the jobs, in terms of caregivers and nurses, how much of those jobs could be done by robots? Right? And so it seems that's certainly an alternative, right? And I mean, I guess construction maybe is more possible in agriculture, but it seems it seems hard to imagine, especially the healthcare side of things, being really taken care of by robots. I feel like the labor shortages are going to remain, especially in those areas. That would be my prediction.
Thank you for the lecture. My question was, with SoftBank Vision Fund and things of the sort, how do you square that with businesses, like sort of interpretation of foreigners and the sort of irony of that they're trying to develop the Silicon Valley culture in Japan without actually bringing the foreigners there?
So tell me about, I don't know about the SoftBank Vision Fund. Tell me about that.
It's essentially the largest ever, not as though it's like a venture capital firm, you know, they're obviously still a bank, but the largest ever investment into foreign companies, tech companies, that Japan or pretty much any country has ever induced. Like one of the more infamous examples is their investment into WeWork, which for reasons independent of their immigration policy has failed. But I was just wondering how the changing business culture in Japan, if you sense that at all, and what that has to do with the business culture.
I talked to a tech industry lobbyist. That was one of the interviews that I did for this work, and he was one of the more pro-immigration people that I spoke with. So he definitely supported, like, we need to get foreigners to be working in these companies. But at the same time, he also did tell me that his position is not shared by everyone in his lobbying organization, which surprised me a little bit. I thought they would be sort of uniformly pro-immigration, but yeah, it does seem like in order. I mean, one of the things that makes Silicon Valley work, it seems to be the ability to bring in new voices and new different kinds of engineers from all over the world. And if Japan is not able to do that, whether it's through regulation or through making Japan's work culture more attractive, then I think it'll be very difficult to develop something like Silicon Valley in Japan.
To return to kind of the public opinion discussion, I'm wondering how that plays out, like rural versus urban, because I'm thinking of, like, particularly like with aging into population being like a much more like severe trend in the countryside, but then also the cities sort of maybe having more familiarity with foreigners as tourists or other sort of people coming in. So if that kind of plays out at all in public opinion, and then if that also sort of filters up towards like an elite level.
Okay, well, this lets me show you something else that I'm really proud of from my book. So I have a couple maps in my book. So this one just shows where the labor shortages are in Japan. And so the labor shortages, I mean, you can see that it's really intense, especially in parts of the Kansai area, especially west over in Hiroshima, but also in a lot of like rural areas up in Kanazawa, et cetera. And of course, Tokyo, it's geographically small, but labor shortages there are really intense too. But in other words, a lot of the labor shortages are most severe in rural areas. And I think perhaps for that reason, the data that I've seen, although I don't have any of it on the slides, suggests that, so age is a really important determinant of public opinion on immigration. So old people tend to be more anti-immigration than younger people. But I feel like when I've seen data that includes, once you control for age, like I don't necessarily think, I don't remember seeing anything which suggests that people living in rural areas actually are more pro-immigration, are more anti-immigration than people living in urban areas. Now, one other thing, so you can see this is where the labor shortages are, and this is where the trainees went, the trainees and technical interns. So you can see there's a pretty close correlation between where the trainees go. Like this was so the idea, the trainee program is formally justified, described as a development program, because the idea is these trainees are supposed to come to Japan, learn skills, and then return to their countries. But you can see very clearly that it's actually, this is a foreign labor program. Like it. Yeah. All right.
I have a question about your 2x2.
Okay.
If you don't mind going back. I was wondering about the lower left quadrant, because it seems like nothing's in it.
Right. That was the one. I was really happy when I realized that. And the Israel and before 93, well, I'll talk about them in a minute.
Well, the question is what's going on, basically.
Right.
So please say whatever you want. But I was just wondering, I figured that obviously the first arrow, you're expecting Japan will sort of move up into the Arab sort of way of addressing, including or not including immigrants, right? So it's sort of these laborers who get the short end of the stick in all sorts of ways. But I was wondering why it wouldn't go left, as and it seems like probably because no place is, but I was wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, this is a really rare situation, and the reason is because overall, if there's a large number of elites that think that foreigners belong, then it's actually not, the state doesn't actually fight that much for them usually against admitting large numbers of foreign residents. But the exception, Israel before 1993, essentially what was happening in Israel was, on the one hand, Israel has its very generous law of return, generous to Jews. So basically any Jewish person from all over the world, as long as Israel recognizes you as Jewish, is able to immigrate there. But on the other hand, there was no, aside from those Jews, there was really no source of foreign labor. But a lot of the low-skilled labor was at this time being done by Palestinians that already lived in Israel. So it's a very unusual situation. But then basically after, in the late 80s and early 90s, you had the Intifada, so you had a lot of tensions between the Palestinians and Israelis picked up. And so because of that, Israel started to import foreign labor rather than relying on the Palestinians. So that's why Israel actually moved out of this box. So this box is very rare, and it was sort of like one maybe unique set of historical circumstances that caused Israel to be in this box for a while.
Great, thank you, Michael. A few questions. There were a couple things that were a little bit confusing to me. So you started off with a number of refugee applications and then asylum seekers and how many.
Okay, sorry.
I want to go back to the 2 by 2.
Okay, I'll go to that.
But so that's one thing, right? Immigration to take labor, to accept more labor. Those are two different things, and but intertwined. My sense is that I've talked to Ministry of Justice officials about this. My sense is that because Japan has a restrictive immigration policy, a lot of foreigners actually try to come through asylum seekers kind of mechanism, and that sort of increases the number of less legitimate looking asylum seekers, and that kind of compounds the problem of Ministry of Justice officials from the beginning being a little bit resistant to accepting asylum seekers. So that I think those two, I think you should separate analytically those two. Another thing is I'm glad that you didn't reduce everything to something about Japanese culture or xenophobia unique to Japan, but the construction of nationhood does matter, I think. And those settler colonies like New Zealand, Australia, US, Canada, they're very different. And countries with civic nationalism like France, UK, those are also different. So I think a good comparison for Japan would be Germany, South Korea. And Germany has for a long time accepted more immigrants, labor from outside. South Korea is beginning to do more of that. I think those are probably fruitful comparison. And on that issue, I think Japan's already, I don't know where you draw the line in the y-axis on this 2 by 2, but Japan is kind of already in the top right in terms of the government official being convinced that it's probably necessary. It just hasn't done that, right? So I guess you look more at the actual reality than the policy ideas. And I think one big reason is something about electoral politics. I'm not an expert on that, but LDP can win without actually delivering, because Keiran and all these business associations have been pushing, right? That's why LDP and many governments, administrations have been trying to accept immigrants, labor, through kind of some sneaky kind of contrived ways, right? Like
some of those visa
Japanese Brazilians and all that. So I think if you could say something about electoral politics that might lead Japan more resistant. And finally, in terms of international image, because you started off with that.
Kyo, I should have been writing this down. You have so many questions.
Oh, okay. I'll let you answer that.
Good.
Yeah.
No. If you have another one, that's fine. But I just want to make sure. Prompt me if I forget something.
Okay. So international image. I think South Korea very clearly has moved in the direction of accepting more foreign labor for international image, right? But so it's great for South Korea. But in general, there are like 8 or 9 key human rights treaties. The least well ratified treaty is the migrant workers' rights. So international law in terms of migrant workers' rights is much less established than some other issues. So like I look at Ainu in Japan, and indigenous rights are very established, so the Japanese government had to relent. So foreign pressure on this issue is less, and look at where USA is going, look at where UK is going. A lot of countries are going against the current of accepting more immigrants. So.
Okay, let me touch on that one first, and then I'll try to work my way backwards, and please help me if I forgot something. So regarding, I think that you're right that like the sort of international law regarding treatment of foreign migrant workers is less severe than it is international law on migrant workers is less demanding than it is, for example, on refugees. And so in my book, when I talk about this, I focus much more on refugee law and refugee norms rather than migrant workers. But however, there were two different times in the last 15 years where the US government threatened to move Japan down on its list of ranking of countries for human trafficking. And Japan changed its behavior in response to that. So one of them actually had to do with the use of the entertainer visa. And the second one had to do, which was basically, it had become basically a sex worker's visa, but almost like a human trafficked sex worker's visa. That's how it was being used. And the US government basically moved Japan, it was from tier 2 to tier 2 minus, and then Japan changed the entertainer visa. And then more recently had to do with the trainee and technical internship program, where they basically said these people are laborers and you're treating them more like indentured servants or something like that. And so Japan actually made reforms. They started to treat trainees and technical internship trainees much more like laborers, so minimum wage, things like that. So on the one hand, I agree that there's less international law in favor of migrants' rights, but Japan actually has been receptive to pressure relating to migrants' rights too.
So human trafficking is a very different issue than migrant labor, but go ahead.
Well, but it was being used, people were being brought in
There's
as
a very
laborers.
strong international norm against human trafficking. Yeah.
Right,
Anyway,
but okay, all right. But the first part of your question had to do with, we talked to officials in the Ministry of Justice, and they sort of suggest that, part of what's happening is these people are really economic, economic migrants pretending to be refugees. That's what they say, right? I've heard that too, right? And I think that's consistent across the developed world. People always say that these are people just trying. We certainly hear it from the President of the United States that refugees aren't real refugees, they're pretending to be refugees. I just heard David Slater, who's doing this really impressive project with a guy from North Georgia, whose name I'm forgetting. You guys, he's an anthropologist. Anyway, okay. They're doing this really incredible project where they're interviewing hundreds of refugee applicants, people that have been rejected for asylum. And they argued, I hadn't heard this before, but they suggested that there's they suggested that many refugee applicants from, I think they said Southeast Asia, particularly the Philippines, there's this network that sort of helps them basically falsify their record. So there are, of the people that apply for asylum, there is a subgroup of them that are likely to not have genuine claims, but they were saying that's not everyone, that's this particular subgroup. But I guess I'm not, I feel like that argument that, these people aren't really refugees, that's not unique to Japan. We see that argument all over the world with countries that are desirable, but also given, it's hard for me to imagine that the typical European country, 20% of the people that are applying would actually have a legitimate claim, but in Japan it would be 0.1%. It seems like there's something else going on rather than the fact that, so really 99.9% of the people asking Japan for asylum have no legitimate claim. That's hard for me to imagine. But your middle point had to do with confession. Oh, electoral, okay. Electoral politics. And I definitely think that you're right. The security of the LDP's position makes it easier for them to ignore this issue. One thing that I've been noticing, I've been looking at this a little bit more carefully, because as the groups like the Zaitokukai and some of these far-right groups in Japan have emerged, the Zaitokukai is a particular kind of right-wing group that's really anti-immigrant in a way that previous far-right groups hadn't been. They're much more. This is a central issue for them. So these groups emerged in maybe the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006. After those groups emerged, I think the LDP actually became less pro-immigration and less pro-foreign labor. It was never extremely pro-immigration, pro-foreign labor, but one thing, I was just looking at this the other day. So there's this issue of granting foreign residents the right to vote in local elections in Japan. Up until 2005, about 20% of LDP candidates and LDP politicians supported that policy. And now it's 1%. And I think that what happened was, as the Zaitokukai and these groups emerged and became more vocal, the LDP worried about them, and so they were less likely. So basically, the pro-immigration voices in the LDP got quieter, or got voted out of office. So I do think electoral politics are important here. And that's why I feel like what the LDP ends up looking like post-Abe, but then also what the opposition ends up looking like what is the Constitutional Democratic Party going to be doing? What kind of alliances are they going to be forming with other parties to the left? I think those things are important to look at in order to understand the future of immigration in Japan.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if I can organize my questions properly, but first of all, I totally agree with you that Japan is unattractive to university professors for several reasons. But I'm wondering, my first question is about sort of the policy making process you're sort of kind of assuming behind this mechanism, because you're talking about, when you are talking about elite thoughts and things like that, you kind of suggested that those thoughts are coming from electoral politics, which is basically some sort of like influential group of people who hate immigration, and LDP politicians hear their opinions, and so that's kind of mechanism. But as far as I know, I mean, even though you're against immigration, accepting more immigration, people would be okay with accepting high-skilled labor, right? I mean, that's the case in the U.S. That's the case in European countries. I'm not sure if there is a research on Japanese attitudes, but that's usually the case in any countries.
It is. It's the case in Japan too.
But it happened actually was basically accepting more low-skilled labor, which seems to me kind of a little inconsistent with what you described as a policymaking process. So that's one question. And another question is...
Can I take that? I don't want to forget. I feel like I forgot some of Kiyo's questions, so let me take that one first, and then I'll come back for your second question. So the reform that I talked about, you're right. And I think one of the things that surprised me about this reform, the reason I think it was probably worthy of a chapter in my book, or maybe a future piece of scholarship, is because it was unusual. Because the reforms that had happened in the past, for example, they set up a point system to reward high-skilled laborers. They made it easier for high-skilled laborers to become permanent residents and citizens. So those are not controversial reforms, and Abe he'll use the word immigration when talking about those higher-skilled people, but it's the lower-skilled people, that's where the word immigration is more controversial. But yeah, but it's funny, the point system, so they set up a point system, but it was, I guess, maybe somewhat similar in that they calibrated it so that I think in the first year, only 7 people had enough points to get in on the point system. So then they had to lower the acceptable score so that more people would come in. But the purpose of the point system was to permit high-skilled laborers. And you're right, that's not particularly controversial in Japan. But now I'm ready for your second question.
So the second question is, those sort of anti-immigration sentiment is it actually about accepting low-skilled labor immigration, or just sentiment against existing Korean descendants or Chinese descendants in Japan? Because to me, Zaitokai's main sort of driving force is sentiment against existing Korean descendants, yes, rather than accepting more foreign workers or foreign students or those people. And so what is sort of the exact thing those people are thinking about? When you see those who answered sort of those who made a xenophobic answer to survey questions, what kind of immigration or what kind of foreign people they are thinking about?
Yeah. So the Zaitoku, you're right about the far right groups. Their issues that they talk most about and they care most about regard especially Koreans in Japan, the Koreans that have been there for a long time, as well as Chinese. But they don't like immigrants either, right? So none of those things are popular. But in terms of who was being thought about, so in our survey experiment, we didn't specify. But I think that when people saw the word foreign labor, especially given that we did this survey experiment just 5 months after this reform was put into place, and just the month after it was actually implemented, it started to happen at the end of April, we did the survey experiment in May. So I think that I would assume that what was on people's minds were low-skilled laborers from, largely from Southeast Asia, but we didn't specify. But there's definitely, the Japanese public responds differently to different kinds of immigrants. Westerners are more popular in Japan than Africans or than East Asian, Southeast Asian. So I do think that's the case. But and that maybe for a future version of this experiment, it would be interesting to vary the race of the immigrants that we're asking about, or the country of origin of the people that we're asking about. Yes.
So follow up on this. Thank you. I'm glad. Thank you for bringing up the extra data you talked about in terms of the surveying about the foreigners in this regard. Do you have plans to connect that with future research on which groups are successful at lobbying the government in terms of immigration? You're mentioning Zaitokai over and again. I think that's a fringe organization that's not representative.
Right.
Whereas I'm spending a lot of time recently, including last week, with Nippon Kaigi,
Right.
which has had a great deal of success in gaining the ear of the Abe cabinet and hundreds of seated diet politicians, unlike someone like Zaitokai,
Right.
for example, and they are heavily invested in shaping policy regarding to immigration and things like that. So do you have a plan to perhaps even connect who's doing what?
It's a great question. I hadn't thought of that, but I think that's a good idea and a good future research agenda. I mean, my sense is not that the Zaitokukai people are sitting down, going to visit LDP and sitting down having civil conversations with the representatives. My sense is that because they're having these huge, nasty demonstrations, the LDP politicians notice that. They're like, wow, we don't want those people angry with us. So we're just going to kind of quiet down. Maybe a little bit like the sort of the alt-right in the US. Like the alt-right, we don't want to anger those people. So we're going to be quiet on the issue that they care about. But yeah, no, I think that's a good.
I agree with Levy that Zaitokai is I don't know how much influence it has on LDP, and also the policy change that resulted, or that didn't result, right?
Yeah.
That it's about resident Koreans
Right.
voting rights in local elections. It has very little to do with immigrant labor's rights or how many they accepted. So that's a very different process. So I think really with refugees, long-term residents like Koreans in Japan, and this new immigrant labor, I think those are very analytically should be distinct and analyzed differently.
Yeah, no, and I think that you're right, but I think that overall the people that support immigration in Japan, and especially that believe that immigrants belong in Japan, also tend to support granting foreign residents the right to vote in local elections. Now, regarding a position that's more directly related to the research that I talked about today, so there was this group of LDP Diet members in 2009 that published this working paper that basically argued that Japan should admit 10 million immigrants. And it was, so I talk about that group in my book, but I think that, so they published that in 2009, but basically in the years after that, I think because, I think maybe I'm using Zaitokukai too much, but I think because of the emergence of groups like Zaitokukai, but also maybe that sentiment among people that are vocal, many of the people that were in that group have moved away from supporting foreign labor or have been voted out of office. So I think that even looking specifically at immigration and about foreign labor rather than people that are already in Japan, I think that there was a time when the LDP released this, it made big headlines at the time, but since then it would be hard to find LDP. There are some still in the LDP that take positions that no, we need immigration, but the numbers have decreased. And I think that's because of a change in public sentiment, not necessarily in terms of numbers, but more in terms of the anti-immigrant people are vocal.
So I agree with that. And so there is this ideological affinity, right, on those three issues. And but the key difference that you identified is whether businesses can convince the government to act or not.
Right.
And on refugees and on Zainichi and all those issues, I'm not that hopeful, but because of this issue of businesses being
Right.
convinced that they need more labor, immigrant labor might be, that's why you kind of argue that might move,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So that's the only
I
reason
think
why I
that's gonna
emphasize.
happen, yeah.
Right. But no, I don't know if refugee situations will change
I don't
any
think
better.
so.
So right, so that's
Not
why
under the
it's
LDP.
different.
Not under the LDP, I don't think it will change, yeah.
I have a question regarding the immigration by international marriage, because I have heard the international marriage in Japan has been increasing. And one of 50 children in Tokyo are half Japanese. So I'm just wondering, how do you think the international marriage make impact on immigration in Japan? And also, you just mentioned about immigration by like a high-skilled worker. However, I have many friends who are American actually, married a Japanese woman or a Japanese man, and live in Japan for a long time. And some people are very, those people are well educated, at least bachelor degree from the US college. But those people have very difficult time to find a job, even though they speak Japanese. They live in Japan long enough, they have a Japanese, but they know the Japanese culture. So I'm just, how do you look at the, high-skilled worker from foreign country can survive in Japan?
Yeah, okay. So the first part of your question had to do with spouses. I don't have a lot to say. I think it's an interesting question. I think I should look more about it. I ranked these in terms of how big they were. So foreign spouses is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, the 9th largest visa category. This data is from last year, I think, from 2018. So there are a lot of foreign spouses in Japan, and therefore there's maybe of the 2.7 million foreigners in Japan, about more than 100,000 of them are foreign spouses. And I'm not sure how they relate to the rest of my argument, or it's something I need to think more about. But the second piece had to do with why maybe well-educated foreigners living in Japan have trouble finding a job. And I think that maybe that has something to do with the way Japanese businesses tend to hire. So they tend to hire certain times, right? So especially college graduation, or there's the hiring practices. And so if you're not on the right train, if you're not there at the exact right time, it will be very difficult to be hired. So I think that's why. So and it's much more difficult for foreigners, especially once they're already in Japan, to be in those exact perfect situations to be hired.
Yeah, but those people have a lot of experience.
Right.
In
But
business.
But the way that Japanese businesses often don't value experiences with other businesses. So Honda wants people that have experience with Honda. They don't want people with experience with Toyota, right? They want people that have their experience with their company. So that's one of the challenges, I think. But.
Well, I think, are there other questions? Please join me in thanking Dr. Strausz for all your wonderful ideas.